Chuck Colson coined the phrase that he had been climbing the ladder of success only to realize that his ladder was leaning on the wrong wall. Born in 1931, 1968, after serving in the Marine Corps, graduating from law school, at the young age of 38, Colson was appointed special counsel to President Nixon. Colson was the boy wonder of politics at the early age of 38. He was known for identifying Nixon's enemies. Someone said Colson boasted he would run over his own grandmother to accelerate his own agenda. He was nicknamed Nixon's hatchet man. He was a ruthless politician. Many of you are too young to remember this, but in 1973, there was this event that happened nationwide that was around the issue of Watergate, where the Republicans, they taped conversations that were going on in the Democratic national headquarters. Many of the highest-ranking Republicans went to prison as a result of it. Colson was one of them. After being sentenced to prison, Colson gave his life to Jesus Christ. It was met with widespread criticism. Skeptics said it was just a publicity stunt to help lessen his sentence to prison. In 1975, Colson was released from prison, and he promised that he would never forget the men and women that he left behind. True to that word, in 1976, he founded Prison Fellowship. Prison Fellowship, over the past 40 years, has become the gold standard for ministering to prisoners. By 1979, the ministry had already grown to in over 100 countries. Colson died in 2012 at the age of 80. Colson today is more known for bringing eternal hope and restoration to those affected by crime and incarceration than for his role in Watergate. I would say this about Colson's life. I believe that he turned the world upside down. Going from successful, power-driven White House executive to that of a minister of the gospel to prisoners. Colson's daughter said this about Colson. She said, "I used to hear Daddy say this, that he used to live for success, and now he would say this over and over again, all I want to be is faithful." I believe it could be said about him, he turned the world upside down. Not by making a name for himself among the elite, but by ministering to the outcasts. For Colson, it wasn't about being a great person, it was about following a great God. The story we're going to look at this morning, there's one phrase in Acts chapter 17, verse 6, in the context where we'll be looking at the first 10 verses of chapter 17. But in verse 6, there's an angry group of anti-Christians. They're in a town called Thessalonica. We'll get to that in a little bit. But this angry group of anti-Christians accused Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke of turning the world upside down. These Christian antagonists mean it as an insult, but the accusation, for those of us over the past 2,000 years, know that this accusation is really a great compliment. Well, what does it mean that somebody turns the world upside down? To answer that question, we need to take a broad, we need to take a deep, and we need to take a measured evaluation of what took place from the time of Jesus' resurrection to this point in history where Acts chapter 17, verse 6 is fleshed out. It's about a 20-year period of time where Paul and Silas are on what historians call Paul's second missionary journey. We need to ask and we need to understand, what does it mean, first of all, what does it mean that they turned the world upside down? Then we need to examine, well, how did they do it? And then the application for us is, how do we follow in their footsteps and continue to turn the world on its ear? There was a fellow years ago, his name was Charles Spurgeon. He was one of those uber brilliant theologians. He died in 1892. He was just 58 years of age when he passed away. Spurgeon did extensive writing on this phrase, "They turned the world upside down," and what it meant. And Spurgeon argued that the world system carries with it a natural order. And he painted the picture. He said, picture a pyramid. And at the top of this pyramid, you've got the most gifted, you've got the wealthiest, you've got the best looking visually people that sit at the summit of this so-called pyramid. Then each level of the pyramid gets progressively more and more insignificant. And at the basement of the pyramid, you've got the multitudes who are the poor and the children. But what's interesting about this pyramid, that's the world's pyramid. Jesus flips the pyramid upside down. What do you mean by that? Well, consider the fact that Jesus said, to enter the kingdom of heaven, you've got to become like a child. Jesus' teaching was about more than, you got to become more than just religiously complicated. You've got to become relationally simple. That's why one of my favorite verses is 2 Corinthians 11:3, which says, "But I'm afraid, lest as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness, your mind should be led astray from the simplicity and purity of devotion to Jesus." It shouldn't be that hard. You know, we try every Sunday morning all across the country, guys like me, try to duplicate some semblance of what Jesus taught, which is impossible. 2,000 years ago, Jesus turned the world upside down with the first sermon he ever preached. I think of the first sermon I ever preached, I just turned people asleep. Still do. And yet, in just 8 sentences in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus flipped what man values and what God values. It's called the Beatitudes. This message isn't a message about the Beatitudes, but I want to go back to that. Just those first 8 sentences in the very first sermon he ever preached. At the top of the pyramid, Jesus says this, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." And what he's saying here is those are the poor in spirit are the ones that realize, I'm weak, God's strong. That thinking turns the world upside down. Contrast that with the idea that the world brings in of climbing the ladder of ambition to be great yourself and for others to praise you. Then Jesus went on and he said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Well, what are they mourning? Well, these are people who mourn that they grieve the sin that imprisons the world. That's what they're mourning over. That's thinking that turns the world upside down. Contrast that to the idea the world brings of capitalizing at other people's expense, of even celebrating someone else's demise. And then Jesus says this, he said, "Blessed are those who are meek. They shall inherit the earth." Well, what's the meek? Well, these aren't vindictive people. These aren't impatient people. But these are people who are strong, but they're under control. That kind of thinking turns the world upside down. And you contrast that to the one who is unforgiving and quick-tempered and more concerned about your production than your development. They give the battle cry, 2 strikes you're out. Not 3 strikes you're out. 2 strikes you're out. And then Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied." These are the people who come to God and say, "God, would you do for me what I cannot do for myself because I'm a sinner?" That kind of thinking turns the world upside down. And you contrast that to those who act better than others. Haughty eyes. They just look down their nose at other people. They act as though they're self-sufficient. They're the ones that come into the room and kind of act like, "Well, you're lucky that I'm even here." And then Jesus said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy." These are the people that treat others ultimately the way they know that God treats them. These are the ones that are said about them, "Oh, they forgive way too much." That's the kind of thinking that turns the world upside down. And yet you contrast that to the world who says, let's hold a grudge. Let's allow our heart to be, let's be offendable. And let's use people's sins against them. Let's be quick to accuse people of their downfall. And then Jesus says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. These are the ones who curb their appetite for the sinful cravings of the lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, the boastful pride of life. And that kind of thinking turns the world upside down. You contrast that to the person that rationalizes their indulgence. Compromise is their battle cry. Then Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. These are people who sacrifice their conveniences so that others could be reconciled to God. And that kind of behavior turns the world upside down. And you contrast that to those that punish their enemies and attack their enemy's character and destroy any chance for any reconciliation. And then Jesus said, blessed are the persecuted who are persecuted on Jesus' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. These are the people who rejoice because they're becoming more Christ-like, because they're being persecuted. And that behavior turns the world upside down. And contrast that to the world that says, well, persecution is about the worst thing that could ever happen to you. So you ought to position yourself to be untouchable. Always have the upper hand, is what the world says. And these behaviors that Jesus taught are the actions that brought Jesus' desire, that brought heaven to bear on planet Earth. I mean, think of it. Jesus taught, love your enemies. Nobody ever said that before. He said, all this money that you have, don't build bigger storehouses. You didn't earn it yourself anyway. I granted it to you, so give away what's mine. Stop trying to work to perceive that you're better. He says, believe in me and I'll help you be better. That is upside down thinking. See, when someone comes to know Jesus Christ for the first time, that person's world should be turned upside down. Turned from finding hope in the world and striving to get rich and get awards and be happy through stuff. You know, every award that you will ever receive will never be enough. It'll just collect dust. They're never enough. Because your heart of stone is unchanged by those things. You'll just want more. But when Jesus comes into us, he turns our hearts soft, where one thing and one thing alone can fulfill that heart, and that is relationship, that is connection, that is a love affair with Jesus himself. And it doesn't wear off. It doesn't collect dust. So in the passage we're going to look at, these accusers of Paul and Silas, that they turned the world upside down. Unbeknownst to them, what they were accusing Paul and Silas of is that, well, Paul and Silas are bringing heaven to bear on earth. And Paul and Silas' behavior reflected the values of heaven. Yes, they were turning the world upside down, but I want us to understand something more accurately. They weren't turning the world upside down. What they were doing is they were turning the world right side up. They were turning people's behavior. It was shifting from being hell-bound to heaven-sent. That's what it means, that they turned the world upside down. And now that we've understood, what does that mean? Now let's look at, well, how did they do it? How did they turn the world upside down? We're going to look at chapter 17 of the book of Acts, verses 1 through 10. This is how they turned the world upside down. We're going to start in verses 1 through 4. I'm reading from the New American Standard Translation. In chapter 17, verse 1 through 4, it says, now, when they traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica. Now, I'm going to show you a map here in just a second. Not yet, but I'm going to show you a map where there was a synagogue of the Jews. Remember, every time they go to someplace, they go to the synagogue first because there's rules of engagement at the synagogue. Come, Let us know what you think. They had the open door there. It was easy to proclaim the gospel at the synagogue. And this was why Timothy, remember, wasn't Jewish. He was circumcised. So he could also go into the synagogue and begin to preach. Verse 2, and according to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths, for 3 weeks in a row, it says he reasoned with them from Scriptures. In verse 3, it says he was explaining to them, and he was giving evidence to them that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, saying, this Jesus whom I'm proclaiming to you is the Christ. He is God and there is no other. And then in verse 4, and some of them were persuaded. So this group in Thessalonica, they're persuaded. They come to know Jesus. And there were those, a large number of Greeks who had no Jewish background. There were a number of Jews, and there were leading women in the city. There was a great response to his evangelistic meeting. Now let me show you the map. Where are they geographically? Have come from Philippi. You see up in the upper left quadrant of your map, you see Philippi. They were chased out of Philippi, so they go over to this place called Thessalonica. It's about a 100-mile journey. It's about a 3-day journey. 100 miles, 3-day journey. Now, this form of oratory persuasion, Paul and Silas are exploding onto mankind, first started with Jesus. And consider Jesus the master communicator. We just looked at the fact that his Beatitudes, he turns the world upside down with just 8 sentences. It'll give us hours and we can't do that. But this before is that we only have 52 days of the life of Jesus in the Gospels. That's all we have. Just 52 snapshots of the life of Jesus. And yet we have 50 individual parables that he taught. He used story to communicate his love for us. He used story to reveal truth to open hearts, to conceal truth to closed hearts. And what was beautiful about it, he placed the cookies of understanding on the bottom shelf. And the story was easy to listen to, and it was easy to remember. And because of the way Jesus communicated, it turned the world upside down. Would you agree? And Jesus' technique was not wasted on his apostles, who continued to use his communication form to turn the world upside down. And we see it right here in this passage. Consider how Paul communicated to the people at Thessalonica 3 weeks in a row. And this was a pattern. By the way, those of us who are smart, we steal this pattern even today. You've been subjected to it already. First he says this, he reasoned with them. The word reasoned, he dialogued with them. This is known as kind of a Socratic method of participating with your audience. Surgically asking questions so as to logically lead your audience to the obvious conclusion, which is God's truth. Now, we don't have the exact transcript of Paul's reasoning. But through his dialogue, he could have used questions like, as he came into Thessalonica and he's talking at the synagogue, he could have used a question like, hey, what are some Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah? The audience could have answered, well, one of them is Psalm 22. Really? Tell me about it. What's in Psalm 22? Psalm 22 is the one where it opens up the first line of Psalm 22. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why does it start that way? What did Jesus say when he was on the cross? Well, I heard he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Well, what does the rest of Psalm 22 say? Well, it talks about what somebody goes through on the cross. As they go through all the steps on the cross and, oh my gosh. Maybe somebody else said Isaiah 53. Well, what does Isaiah 53 say? Well, it says we were crushed. He was crushed for our transgressions. And verse 12 says he bore our sin. It says he was pierced for our iniquities. He was scourged for our transgressions. Paul is reasoning with them, helping them discover oh my gosh, it was Jesus' actions that these prophecies captured 800, 900 years previously are talking about. So he says, first of all, he starts off with them in this 3 weeks of preaching to them. He reasons with them. Then it says he explained to them. The word means tearing open a letter so as to clearly see. In that regard, he could have said, hey, let's do this. Let's open up Isaiah chapter 53, verses 3 through 12. Let's closely examine it. Let's observe. Let's interpret. Who is he talking about? That's what we're doing right now. Acts, just bear with me. I don't know what's going on. It's not my voice, I promise you. That's what we're doing right now as we're opening up Acts. We're explaining the Scriptures. We're opening it up as to expose what's being taught. Then third, it says he gave evidence. This is the idea of persuading an audience by using overwhelming apologetics. I'm sure Paul probably said, hey, you go back to the cross. 2 professional executioners signed his death certificate. He was put in a tomb. A 2-ton stone was rolled over the entrance of a tomb. A Roman guard was placed around the tomb. 16 Roman soldiers who gave their life to making sure nobody got in that tomb. A Roman seal, a wax seal placed upon the covering saying if anybody tampered this, it was death. And yet, we know after 3 days the tomb was empty. That Jesus, he appeared to the 12, he appeared to over 400 people over a 40-day period of time. And then Paul would personalize it and say, he appeared to me on the road to Damascus, and Jesus is alive. And here the reasoning, he would have said, if he's not alive, all they would have had to do is pull his corpse out of the tomb, but the tomb was empty. And I'm sure Paul used the words he will later write to the church at Corinth where he says, thanks be to God who gives us victory through the death of Jesus. Because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we're free. These 3 techniques have always been used for conversations, for persuasive communication. And when the Holy Spirit works, people's thoughts are turned right side up. And in this case, there were Jews and there were Greeks and there were women who were starting to believe. But remember the pattern that we have looked at in the book of Acts. Everywhere Jesus goes and everywhere Jesus transforms lives, Satan follows to try to steal, kill, and destroy. So now we pick it up in verses 5 through 8. It says this, but the Jews, and these Jews it's talking about in verse 5, are the ones that rejected Paul's teaching about Jesus. These Jews became jealous. They wanted a following. Paul and Silas were having a following. They wanted a following, and they were jealous because of it. And so taking along some wicked men, they drummed up some mercenaries with them from the marketplace and formed a mob. You remember what we talked about? Satan loves a good mob. And they set the city in an uproar. The meaning behind that, it's impossible to have a healthy relationship with illogical thinkers. And they went and attacked the house of Jason. Well, Jason was a guy who was housing Paul and Silas and all of his crew who were with him. So he was just a Christian in the city of Thessalonica. And this mob were seeking Silas out. And when they couldn't find them, they began dragging Jason and some brethren before the city authorities, shouting, "These men have upset the world and have come here also." Meaning they turned the world upside down. That's what that phrase means. Then in verse 7, and Jason has welcomed them into their house, and they all act contrary to the decrees of Caesar. You remember Caesar is a human dictator. And they're promoting this theocracy where Jesus is king. And the Romans had a hard time with that. Any human king in the way of their king, any god in the way of their human king, they just had a hard time with it. And so verse 8, it says this mob, they stirred the crowd and the city authorities who heard these things. The word that's used is envy. Paul and Silas and the crew were gaining a Christ following, and the Jews who refused to believe in Jesus were envious. They wanted a following like Paul was getting. So they stir a mob into an illogical frenzy to stop the influence. Jason was just a believer housing Paul and the gang. When the mob couldn't find Paul and Silas, next best thing, let's turn our attention to the host, Jason. And that's when the phrase, "These men have turned the world upside down," exploded on the scene. The accusation was the greatest compliment that could be paid to a group of believers. Heaven was coming to bear on planet Earth. And Satan wanted the territory that he used to influence, and he wanted it back. But I want you to understand something. Satan is very limited in his ability. Satan cannot reason well. Satan cannot explain well. Satan has no evidence to use in his persuasion. This is what Satan has at his disposal. Satan has deception. Calling good evil and evil good. Think about the very accusation that the mob is able to use. They turned the world upside down. You and I know that's a good thing. But Satan is using that statement to convince people that it's a bad thing. And that technique continues to be Satan's main staple to persuade. Call that which is good, bad, and that which is bad, good. Let me prove my point to you. Throughout history, that's where you've been duped as well. Remember at the end of creation, God said it was good. And as God created them male and female, he said, this is good. But Satan says, that's bad. You know, I'm trying to think of the most annoying voice I can possibly think of. And I'm thinking there's this character in I Am Sam who says, and I'm thinking Satan must have sounded like that when he said, well, that's bad. It's kind of a little Forrest Gump in there. I promise I won't do that again. God's created marriage between one man and one woman, and God says that's good. And Satan says, no, that's bad. God created mankind in his own image. In Psalm 139, it says, God crafted you and me in our mother's womb, and God says that's good. Satan says, no, that's bad. God says, let the bride of your youth satisfy you at all time, and God says, no, that's really good. And Satan says, no, that's bad. On the reverse of that, God says, haughty eyes, lying tongue, shedding innocent blood, planning wicked deeds, seeking after evil, slandering someone, sowing discord. God says those are bad. But Satan, the flip side of that, says, no, those are really good. God says, you want to find your life? Lose it, and that's good. But Satan says that's bad. God says the human heart is desperately sick. And Satan says, no, your heart is great. I want you to observe something. All that God identifies as good and bad is in writing, and it's verifiable. All Satan has is lies. Lies that come out in dark places. Dark, illogical, deceptive places. That's why God clearly says to us in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 20, woe to those who call good evil and evil good. And when people follow Satan's lies, unbeknownst to them, they're following Satan straight into hell. Well, how do you know that? Because that is Satan's destination. Well, how do you know? Because we have the photo of the finish line. It's in Revelation chapter 20, verse 10. It's the photo finish where the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone. By the way, let me just kind of take a couple of little rabbit trails here. A mob. You know what a mob is? And this is the definition I want to give to a mob. A mob is a large group that simultaneously are angered to hurt someone. That's what a mob is. A mob is a large group of people that simultaneously they're angered to hurt someone. And a mob is only a mob because they are deceived into believing lies. And that's why a group of believers that follow truth should never be turned into a mob. So how do you know when a mob is wrong? Because it's a mob. And that's what makes it wrong. Let me give you another little rabbit trail. Any worldly system that believes in the idea that their political system is the standard and does not answer to God will always be threatened by God. And no system that places itself above God has any chance of survival and is destined to self-destruct. Let me say it another way. No atheistic, there is no God form of government can ever survive. Because all they have is a system that's based upon man's self-centered worldly thinking. And only when we buy into right-side-up thinking, where we die to ourselves for someone else's greater good, is self-governance possible. And that only comes from biblical thinking. Now I want to put a book into this. I want you to see verse 9 and 10. And I want you to see this very clearly. Mobs never win. Because once people come to their senses, the mob dissolves. See, the mob can be incited, but it cannot be maintained. Illogical anger cannot be maintained. It eventually starts breaking off when people come to their senses. It's like a dry cookie that begins to crumble. So look at verse 9 and 10. And when they had when they had received a pledge from Jason, these are the magistrates in Thessalonica. When they received a pledge from Jason and the others, they released them. The pledge there, basically, Jason is putting a security deposit down to say, okay, I'll do everything I can to make sure we do all we can to make sure there's not a mob gathering again. And then verse 10, and the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night. They went to Berea. And when they arrived, guess where they went? They went to the synagogue, because that's a great place to start a ministry. They left quietly. They went to the synagogue. Let me show you the map. Thessalonica. They get chased out of town. They go southwest to Berea. First place they go, no surprise. They go to the synagogue. I want you to observe a pattern. And it's a pattern we've observed over the past several chapters in the book of Acts. Go back with me on their journey. You remember they went to Pisidian Antioch. They started a church. But evil chased them out of town. They went to Iconium. They started a church. But evil chased them out of town. No problem. They went to Lystra. They started a church. And evil chased them out of town. They go to Philippi. They start a church. And evil chased them out of town. They've come to Thessalonica. They start a church. And evil chased them out of town. And now they come to Berea. And they're starting a church. All evil has accomplished is assisted God's plan to start new churches. You cannot outflank God. God always uses behavior He does not approve of to accelerate future growth. So next time you see, and you will see, where evil will attempt to halt truth, take comfort in knowing it can't. It never has, it never will. God will use whatever evil throws at His followers to open up new fields of productivity. And I want to say that again. God will always use whatever evil throws at His followers to open up new fields of productivity. That's why the world will always continue to be turned right side up by the actions of Jesus' followers. Let me conclude with a thought, and I don't want you to miss this. Have you ever noticed God does not do things the way we would naturally do things to turn the world right side up? You ever notice that? And that's okay. You don't have to give me a public affirmation here. God doesn't do things that we would do If we were going to turn the world right side up, we would do it differently than the way God does it. If we wanted to change the world on our own, we would not do it Jesus' way. I want to show you a picture. Julie and I lately we've kind of been looking at a lot of our pictures from our trip to Israel, and I want to show you a picture. Boy, is that exciting. That was a discovery about 7 years ago. You know, the interesting thing, there's always new discoveries in Israel, and all these new discoveries, you know what they do? They always just verify what we already knew. That Jesus is real, that he was who he was, we said he was. This is in a city called Magdala. It's the synagogue from the time of Jesus in the city of Magdala. Jesus would have walked on those little stones, which is kind of cool. I mean, it didn't make you more, if you went out and touched the stone, you can't, but if you went up and touched the stones, it wouldn't make you more spiritual. But it's kind of cool to go, wait, Jesus was in there. This little place called Magdala was out of the way. It was the hometown of a woman named Mary of Magdala. At her starting, she wasn't what the city was very proud of. Now there's probably a sign that says, home of Mary of Magdala. But originally she was a black eye on the city. She had 7 demons in her. She was the quintessential evil woman. Magdala was one of those places, it was nowhere. Some people would say it was almost as bad as Nazareth. And then all of a sudden, Mary comes in contact with Jesus. Jesus gets these 7 demons out of her. And the hole in her heart from these 7 demons leaving her was filled by God himself as she became impassioned about following Jesus. She would financially support Jesus' ministry. But I think the thing that is so interesting about Mary, you know, when Jesus was on the cross, and we talked about this in our Sunday school class earlier, when all the apostles scattered, when they were afraid, when Jesus was hanging on the cross, you know who didn't scatter? Mary. Everybody else fled. She stayed. She was also the first one at the tomb. The tomb was empty. She was the first one there. Nobody else came. She was the last to say goodbye to our Savior. She was the first to say hello. Now please hear me out. If the world today decided they were going to write a story of a Savior that visited our planet, they would never make a demonically possessed woman with a shady past from nowhere out to be one of the greatest influential heroes of God's eternal kingdom. But God's ways of doing things aren't our ways, and God's ways of doing things turn the world upside down. Or they turn them right side up. You know, when we look at the story of Jesus, we like to think of ourselves as Jesus, but we are not even remotely close to Jesus. Don't ever do that to yourself. We're Mary in the story. And aren't you glad? Because God turns down and out, shame-filled people like me, like you, into beautiful messengers for his eternal kingdom. Everything about Jesus' kingdom is backwards from our worldly system. Our worldly system says, hey, appear that you've got it all together. Man, prop your image up. Don't show weaknesses. And Jesus is like, show your weaknesses. Because it's not about following great people. It's about following a great God. And when we show our weaknesses and we say, I'm broken, but God is the one who repaired me. And you know what the thing is that, and I want you to hear me, please. The thing that keeps us from sharing any sort of weakness, the thing that causes us to want to prop ourselves up and make ourselves look better than we deserve, because we certainly want to be at the top of that world's pyramid, the thing that keeps us from sharing who we are is shame. Guilt is feeling bad for what you do. Shame is feeling bad for who you are. Shame's a horrible thing. Jesus died on the cross to take away our shame. And so there's something so freeing about going, man, I'm broken. That's what he taught in the Beatitudes. I'm weak, but you're strong. And I'm so glad. And I think so much of the time, aren't you tired of just trying to make yourself look better than you are? And it's just so much easier to go, I'm broken. God, would you send help today? And when it comes, would I be wise enough to apply it when it comes? I am broken, and you are not. And it's not about following a great person. It's about following a perfect God. Wow, that's freeing. That's why Jesus uses the Marys of Magdala to turn the world right side up. That's why Jesus uses the Chuck Colsons of the world who go, man, I was guilty. I went to prison. I'm broken, but God is the one who can restore me. And let me tell you about my great God. See, the shame is what keeps us, don't share that. People might think less of us. Guess what? People already think less of us.